honored and privileged to preside over the panel discussion session. Well, basically KDI has studied evidence-based policies throughout for the last 50 years, basically. And since the 2000, when I joined KDI, I have observed more than half of the papers are empirical, which is evidence-based research. But today, the conference is very meaningful because we are talking about how to incorporate study into the policy development and design. In that sense, well, the Korea is like many other countries. Korea is also have much of difficulties in fiscal policies because we have a growing income disparities and many social demands. So, in such a case, the fiscal authorities have a lot of pressures, especially after the coronavirus. So we need more efficient and effective social policies. So in this sense, today's conference is very, very timely and relevant. So as far as I know, today's theme is not just policy, evidence-based policy evaluation. We are talking about how to incorporate this policy evaluation into the real policy making and design, and the feedback between the some study and actual implementation. So we may face some many different types of difficulties and challenges and limitations. For example, like technical difficulties or political pressure and organizational or governance difficulties or communication level. So we have three distinguished discussants, two from the OECD scholars who have already presented papers in the session 2, and one more discussant from the Ministry of Finance Economy of Korea, Kyungchul. So we have a very tight schedule. We are already behind schedule. So let me give each panel discussant about 3 to 5 minutes. And the question is like this. What are the limitations, difficulties, and challenges when we applied evidence-based policy evaluation to actual policy design and budgeting process? Plus, you may tell your answers based on your experiences or observations, and if possible, I ask you to answer like some suggestions to Korean government, which is on the verge of introducing and running the policy experiment at the policy making process. So let me give the first speak to Thomas Braendle. Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for raising this important point. I will try to keep to the 2 to 3 minutes limits, maybe 4. Well, limitations and difficulties in applying policy experience we discussed. I mean, all of the presentations were highlighting different aspects of that. I think, as outlined before, the policy experiments that are based on RCTs, right, which are somehow in the focus, allow estimating the causal effect of policy interventions and are thus a very robust method, right? So it's a very credible method for establishing evidence. Having said that, much depends, of course, on the costs and the benefits of running a policy experiment, as Chiara highlighted. And I mean, on the cost side, policy experiments can be cheap when you look at services that are already being delivered and at outcome data that are already being collected. And in that sense, there are many options where you can start to look at and make and establish robust analysis and also establish robust evidence. But then, I mean, the other important limitation by definition is, of course, that RCTs are useful for scientific credibility, but they also retail restrictions on the scope of policy problems, right, that can be studied with such a method. In that sense, I completely agree with Chiara that, I mean, depending on the question at stake, you should also look at other methods that might be more informative than only using RCTs. But still, the policy process is not always perfectly plannable, and therefore the use or the planning of evidence policy assessments is not always perfectly possible. So what can I say as recommendations for Korea that is thinking about establishing such systematic pre-assessments? I think, of course, tailor-made recommendations are always difficult and very much depend on the specific institutional and political context and also the political ambition. Nevertheless, I see several points that are based on the OECD experience seem very advisable to be taken into considerations. That are first the 6 elements I highlighted from the UK experience. So you need somehow ensure administrative and political support, make sure that you use good and competent people with different backgrounds. Choose an institutional location that is close to the president or close to the Ministry of Finance, so that the pre-assessment unit can have influence, and make consequent use of robust empirical methods, and also closely interact with academics, either in-house or via close cooperation with academia or universities, set up ideally an advisory panel, and also transparently report about the activities where you do policy assessments in a systematic way. And finally, I mean, as resources for systematic pre-assessment and using policy experimentations are always limited, it is of course important, as highlighted by the Dutch colleague, for instance, that you have to strategically select the topics and the public policy areas where you start to work with. And this should be ideally in areas where you have data and where also experience from other countries says, well, here we can bring an added value to the policy discussion and also show the value to citizens more generally.
Thank you, Thomas. You have mentioned the importance of political support and the importance of the transparency in this process. Now, Dr. Chiara Varazzani, your turn.
Sure. Thank you so much for these great questions. So I think in my presentation I already gave an overview of some of the limitations. I think they're the most important. But I would like to add 2, if possible, here. So in my experience, really, one of the biggest limitations is time to test, time to experiment. And especially during this COVID-19 crisis, the global community of behavioral scientists, but in general of people applying policy experiments to policy. It was really a wake-up call where we really understood that sometimes we have to provide evidence in just a matter of hours. So I would say that going forward, I believe that Korea, together with other countries around the world, we should really make more efforts to try and accelerate the generation of evidence through policy experiments. I have many ideas on how to do that, so I would love to continue this conversation. Another limitation that we didn't really touch upon so much during this discussion is the fact that policy experiments are really great to provide robust evidence on one specific policy issue. So for example, if you want more people to pay more taxes, you can run a policy experiment. If you want to have medical doctors to prescribe less antibiotics, you can run a policy experiment. But one limitation is, what about all the rest? So we are not really measuring the impact or the unintended consequences of doing these things on the system. So really, I think one of the biggest limitations of policy experiments approach it's really the fact that we don't have a system thinking approach where you look at the whole political ecosystem and you try to see what is the effect of doing one single policy experiment on the overall system. So again, this is a limitation. I think we should work more on this. Now, on the second point, which is about the institutional setup. So I've worked in several governments and in different units with different setups. I would say that if you want, there are mainly 2 or 3 models. One is a more centralized model and one is a more diffused model. So in a centralized model, you have a unit of experts, most of the time based in central agencies like the Ministry of Finance. And in the other model, you will have more of diffuse organization where you have experts able to run experiments in all the different departments, very similar to what the Netherlands had. Well, in my experience, I really think that at the very beginning, having a centralized group of people and a very strong team is fundamental, especially because at the very beginning, we dreamt about the idea of the concept of training the trainers. So for example, just explaining how to run policy experiments to colleagues in government. But in reality, it's very, very difficult to do that without the real experience on the field. And after years of thinking about the questions, I really think that having centralized units may be reducing size over time, but I really think it's very important because it's a center of excellence of people who can really make sure that whatever policy experiments we are running, this is like the latest possible developments in the field. So it's really important to keep that excellence and that forward-thinking approach with a centralized unit. And the last bit was about considerations for Korea. So I will have a very long list, but I will need to select some of my suggestions. My first suggestion is try to embed policy experiments in the default system. So it's very difficult to convince and change the system by just having ad hoc experiments on small bits and pieces. One thing that it will be very impactful, and it has been impactful around the world, is really to change a little bit of how government make decisions on budget, but as well evaluate the success of its activities. So for example, changing the default will be, for example, introducing the need to embed a policy experiment in, for example, regulatory impact assessment. So regulatory impact assessments are basically just a document that policymakers have to produce when a new regulation has to come in. Well, it would be great to, instead of just having a post-hoc evaluation, to ask for generating new evidence through a policy experiment. So that's the first thing, changing the default and thinking about the system, not only the end of the policy cycle. The second thing is about being flexible and opportunistic in policy experiments. So I think it's very important to never miss the opportunity of running a policy experiment. And if you connect this with what I said at the very beginning about time, it means that, in my opinion, for example, I have a rule for government. Every time we run a survey on our citizens, one thing that I think is very important is to run a small experiment as well, of course, with all the ethical clearance. But I think it's important not only to have observational studies, but really to try and have collect empirical evidence every time we have the opportunity to do so. Another thing that I really encourage you to do is to set expectations very early on. And as Jon Blondel just mentioned before, I think it will be fundamental in terms of keeping the reputation of the policy experiments team constant over time. So setting expectation is really important. And finally, I just wanted to close with the importance of consulting with the best people globally. So there's a lot of expertise around the world. And at the OECD, we'll be, of course, very happy to sustain your efforts in running policy experiments going forward. But it's really important to have the best possible people on board very early on. And that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you very much, Chiara. You have mentioned the very important point of the fundamental limitations of these evidence policy program evaluation, and also you have very useful comment and suggestion to Korean government. Now we have the officer from the Korean government, and let's listen to what he faces. In terms, kind of difficulties and limitations, and how to overcome such kind of hurdles. Could you, please?
Thank you, Dr. Kang, and thank you, Mr. Braendle and Mrs. Varazzani for the nice and detailed advice for the Korean government. I understood that political support and institutional setup or dedicated unit inside the Ministry of Finance, or using best knowledge could be critical elements to do this kind of thing. As a practitioner of Korean government, let me talk about inside the story in the Korean government. This year we have spent a lot. We have spent a lot of money to overcome the crisis. Now time is coming, and I think most of the countries in the OECD will be looking at two things in the future. On the one hand, they will take care of fiscal sustainability thing, and on the other hand, increasing the value of budget, current budget, increasing the performance of budget. So our theme is related with increasing the value of budget. In this regard, I think measuring the performance of a budget and giving feedback will become much more crucial in the future. So evidence-based policy evaluation is very, very fancy things to Korea government. And we all know that the data-based, evidence-based, and performance-based budgeting is a good thing. But evidence-based evaluation or nudge team trial these are not the things that Korea government has done so far. So in Korea, we have already developed various fiscal evaluation system. The main thing is fiscal performance management system and the self-evaluation by the line ministries. And as a third party, Ministry of Finance also runs various fiscal evaluations, such as subsidy program evaluation, fund evaluation, in-depth review, or there are a lot of evaluations. And also, the KDI is performing pre-assessment, pre-feasibility assessment, which is, I know, is very strong around the world. It's well established. But with this evaluation system, if you evaluate the evaluation system of Korea, I think I assume that there will be three comparative characteristics in Korea. First thing is that Korean evaluation system is very, very swift, very, very fast. And Koreans like 빨리빨리, fast things. So evaluation period usually is very short. It takes just only 2 months, 3 months, and people cannot wait a year-long or 2 years result. So that's how Korea has developed so far. So, and the second thing is that the budget evaluation system of Korea is very strong and firm because it is legally institutionalized already. This means that it provides less flexibility to try a different kind of things, such as RCT or Dutch team. And third thing is that Korea, I think Korean government still believes that it is developing very fast, and it likes to introduce new budget, introducing new budget. That means, frankly speaking, Korean government pay less attention to managing all the existing budget and increasing the performance of existing budget. So these three things are the characteristics, and also I think it should be acting as a limitation to try a whole new different RCT, basic income experiment thing, or Nazi unit team things. But as I told you already, we will take care of the fiscal performance in the future more and more, and things will be changing, and we will step by step, we will change it step by step. And for example, through this consultation, the Ministry of Finance will give simple guidelines to the line ministries. For example, when the line ministries are performing their own program evaluation, those program evaluation usually lacks objectivity. The program evaluation usually depends on beneficiary satisfaction interview things, and they utilize it as a scale-up of their own budget. So in order to change it, we will give the basic guidelines, such as they should measure the outcome of the project, and they should pay more attention to the causality of budget and benefit things. Thank you for the conference, and thank you for the discussion, and then we could find out a more applicable solution in the future and doing better. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Nam. Well, Mr. Nam delivers various concerns as a policymaker, and I think this is an era of fiscal policy, and inside of fiscal policy, the social policy is at the center, And social policy is the area where the conflicts of interest are prevailing, and sometimes there are opposing hypotheses which are bumping each other and predict totally different kind of predictions and outcomes. So in this arena, we need some of the evidence-based empirical test. And applying this test to the policy process is very important in terms of reducing the cost and maximizing the benefit. So in this context, I think today's conference on the evidence-based policy evaluation is one of the venue for the Korean government to launch this methodology in the practical real policymaking process, I think. So thank you very much, and thank you very much participating very early in the morning in Paris, and also we have many audience late in the evening in Seoul. So let's call it a session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.